What happens when jealousy turns into a curse? When one moment of jealousy changes history forever? These aren't just ideas or lessons from old scrolls. They are the shadows that still affect our lives today. The story of Cain and Abel, which has fascinated, scared, and inspired generations, is in the first few chapters of the Bible. Two brothers, two lives, one choice that would have effects for a long time. The first murder in human history, an act of violence that not only marked a man but also became a symbol of sin, exile, and the long-lasting effects of human actions. This isn't just a story from long ago, it's also a story about feelings we all know, like jealousy, ambition, pride, and the need to please those we care about. Think about the ancient world, when people lived close to the land and their survival depended on it, the harvest and their flocks. Cain, the farmer, worked the land day and night, hoping for a sign that God was pleased with his work. Abel, the shepherd, took good care of his flocks and seemed to be favored because his offerings were accepted and his heart was pure. What Cain couldn't understand, and what bothered him in the quiet of the fields and under the watchful stars, was why his brother's sacrifices were chosen over his own. And in the shadow of that jealousy, the seeds of tragedy began to grow. The brothers' fight wasn't just about gifts or God's favor. It was also about how people feel, the battle between right and wrong, and the choices we make when we feel desire, anger, or doubt. As the story moves through time, it ends up in medieval Europe, where artists, scholars, and storytellers painted, wrote, and talked about it with awe and interest. In illuminated manuscripts, Cain's face was shadowed by guilt and fear as he walked through stormy skies. Tapestries and stained glass windows showed the moment of murder, the first act of violence by a human being, in vivid, haunting images that spoke to both the mind and the soul. In this case, the story was more than just history. It was a lesson in morality, a look at human nature, and a warning about what can happen when envy goes unchecked. This documentary will take us into the world of Cain, Abel, and the medieval people who told their story. We will look into where this story came from, what it means, and what lessons can be learned from history's dark places. We will see how jealous Cain was, how innocent Abel was, and the moment that changed everything. We will also look at how medieval societies understood the story and how they used morality, religion, and human psychology to make a story that still speaks to us today. We want to make this story come to life through movie-style storytelling, powerful images, and a lot of historical context. We want it to be more than just a distant myth. We want it to be a vivid look at human emotion, divine justice, and the choices that make us who we are. Imagine the misty forests, the old fields, the flickering candles lighting up dark manuscripts, and the tension between two brothers who are caught up in fate. As we start this journey, please remember that you, our viewer, mean a lot to us. We hope this journey with you lasts for a long time. Please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Please help us get 10,000 subscribers so we can keep making content that is deep and meaningful for you. You can also help us out by sending a super thanks, which lets us do more research and bring you even more interesting information. We're curious about where you're watching this video from and what time it is. Please tell us your name and where you live in the comments. If you want to own a full English version of the Bible with all 88 books and the Book of Enoch, the link is in the description. Now, breathe deeply. Go into the dark parts of history. Come with us to the old fields where Cain and Abel lived, where human feelings clashed with God's will, and where one man's choices became a story that has been told for thousands of years. This is a story about envy, sin, exile, and reflection. It starts with a question and still makes us think today. Let's get into the story now and learn about the first murder, the curse, and the lasting legacy of Cain in medieval stories. Long before medieval scholars used gold and ink to decorate parchment, and long before cathedrals rang with sermons about sin and obedience, the story of Cain and Abel was already in the minds of all people. To comprehend the tenacity with which medieval Europe adhered to this narrative, one must venture far back beyond castles and monasteries into the ancient realm where the story was initially articulated, recalled, and inscribed. The story of Cain and Abel is in the book of Genesis, which is one of the first books of the Bible. This was a world that was still trying to figure things out, why people have problems, why pain exists, and why moral choices have effects. In the past, People didn't separate their spiritual lives from their daily lives. The land, the harvest, birth, death, and God's favor were all very closely linked. In that world, stories weren't just for fun. They were ways to make sense of life. Cain and Abel stand for two important ways of life in early human civilization. We learn that Cain is a farmer who works the ground. His life depended on the seasons, the rain, and the earth's unpredictable fertility. Abel, on the other hand, was a shepherd who took care of sheep and was rich enough to walk with them and breathe under his care. It wasn't by chance that these two roles were farmer and shepherd. They showed real problems that people had in ancient times, when settled farming life often clashed with nomadic or semi-nomadic pastoral cultures. Long before the story turned into moral theology, it was also a reflection of real life. Stories about brothers and sisters fighting were common in the ancient Near East. Many myths from Mesopotamia, Sumer, and Akkad were about brothers fighting for God's favor, inheritance, or power. These stories asked a troubling question: why does one person do well while another, just as dedicated, feels left out? The story of Cain and Abel fits perfectly into this old pattern, but it has a moral depth that makes it stand out. The violence itself didn't make this story powerful. It was the slow, emotional journey that led up to it. From the start, Cain isn't shown to be a monster. He works, he gives, and he hopes. The text says that when his offering is not accepted, his face falls, which is an old way of showing that he is hurt, humiliated, and ashamed. People who saw this early on would have known how it felt right away. In their world, being favored by God meant living, and being rejected meant dying. In these early cultures, sacrifice was a way for people to talk to the gods. It wasn't just about the gift itself. It was also about the intention, respect, and trust. The best thing Abel had was the firstborn of his flock. There is not as much emphasis on Cain's offering, even though it is mentioned. People who listened to this a long time ago would have understood this small difference. The story quietly makes you think, was Cain's failure about what he gave or about how he felt? The story introduces a deep idea even in its earliest form, that people are warned before they fall. Someone tells Cain that sin is waiting for him at the door, but he must rule over it. This was a very new idea for its time. It proposed that individuals are not powerless victims of fate or divine caprice. They have the power to act. Choice is important. There is responsibility. The words are short, but the meaning is huge when Cain kills Abel. People say that the ground itself cries out, soaking up blood and becoming a witness. This was a scary picture for ancient cultures that thought the earth was alive and holy. When violence happened, it didn't just go away. It left a mark on creation. The land that used to grow food would now fight against Cain. Survival and morality were two sides of the same coin. As this story was passed down orally from generation to generation, it became a guide for how to live. Parents used it to tell their kids to be careful. Elders used it to talk about why communities fell apart. Leaders used it to teach people to be responsible. Before medieval theology turned it into doctrine, the story of Cain was like a mirror that made people face uncomfortable truths about jealousy, anger, and unchecked desire. The story of Cain and Abel was put near the beginning of the Hebrew scriptures on purpose, not by chance. It comes right after people were kicked out of Eden, which shows that sin doesn't end with disobedience, it spreads through human relationships. The loss of innocence isn't just between people and God, it's also between brothers. This old story had already been around for thousands of years by the time it got to medieval Europe. People in the Middle Ages did not think of Cain as a distant or made-up figure. They thought they knew him. A farmer who was jealous of favor, a brother who was full of resentment, and a man who was warned but didn't want to face his own darkness. These things felt like they would last forever because they did. It is important to know where these ideas came from, because medieval interpretations didn't make up new meanings, they just made old ones stronger. The monks, scholars, and artists of the Middle Ages got a story that was already full of symbols, psychology, and moral tension. They put it in their own world of feudal loyalty, divine order, and social hierarchy, making Cain a warning that fit their time. Before Cain became a stained glass window or a topic of debate in religious texts, he was just a man in a field struggling with a feeling he couldn't control. And everything else would happen from that ancient moment, which was quiet, human, and very dangerous. Not as legends or symbols, but as real people with real lives who are shaped by their surroundings their work, and their need to be seen. They are the first generation born outside of Eden and raised in a world that has already been broken by loss. Adam and Eve, their parents, carried the memory of paradise and the pain of being exiled. This unspoken sadness was the emotional background in which these two brothers grew up. First, we meet Cain, the older brother. He works the land every day, pushing seeds into soil that doesn't give up easily anymore. Farming in the past was hard and unforgiving. One bad season could mean death or hunger. His hands were rough, and his life was full of waiting and working hard. There was always uncertainty with each harvest. He didn't see beauty when he looked at the earth. He saw survival. His work was always hard, tiring, and very personal. The ground was both his source of income and his burden. Abel's life went in a different direction. As a shepherd, he had to move around, watch over the sheep, and take care of them. He led living things, kept them safe, and learned how they moved. His money lived and breathed in the open air. Shepherds lived on the edge of danger, like predators, storms, and theft, but they also felt a deep connection to life. Abel's job required him to be attentive instead of forceful, and to trust instead of controlling. These differences were important. In ancient cultures, work defined who a person was. Cain and Abel didn't just do different jobs, they also had different relationships with the world around them. Cain had a hard time getting life out of soil that didn't want to give it up. Abel reacted to the life that had already been given. There was nothing wrong with either role, but the difference between them made it easy for people to get confused. Both brothers were happy to bring gifts to God when the time came. This detail is very important. Cain didn't say no to worship. He didn't turn his back on God. He brought an offering from the ground's fruit, which he had worked hard for and earned. Abel carefully and clearly described the firstborn of his flock and their fat parts. There is a small but strong difference in the way they are described. Abel's gift shows intention, priority, and trust. Cain's gift, while sincere, seems restrained, as if he is afraid. The text does not make it clear why God did what he did, and that is on purpose. People who listened to the ancient texts were not supposed to figure out how God worked. They were supposed to think about how people stand. Cain's response shows a lot more than God's choice. When Abel's offering is looked at and Cain's isn't, Cain's face falls. This is the most emotional part of the story. The scene where they offer something is short, but what happens next happens slowly, inside, and in a dangerous way. Cain doesn't get angry right away. He pulls back into himself. Anger lies beneath shame. Envy starts to talk. Abel becomes a mirror that shows Cain everything he is afraid of, that no one sees his hard work, that no one appreciates it, and that he is less valuable. This is not jealousy of wealth or power, but jealousy of approval. Cain wants what Abel seems to have without much effort: favor. What makes this moment very human is that Cain is told to be careful. God talks to him directly, not about what he did but how he feels. Someone tells Cain that they can see his anger and that his inner state is dangerous. He is reminded that he has a choice. Sin is like a predator waiting to pounce, but he can still control it. This warning changes how we think about Cain's fight. He is not yet condemned. He has to take on responsibility. In the story, though, Abel doesn't say anything. He doesn't brag. He doesn't stand up for himself. He doesn't blame his brother. People have often thought that his silence meant he was innocent, but it also makes the imbalance worse. Abel is unaware of or does not react to the tempest developing within Cain. The story doesn't let you make Abel perfect and Cain evil. It focuses on how things look instead. Cain feels small, and that feeling starts to change how he sees the world. The setting is very symbolic when Cain talks to Abel and takes him into the field. The field belongs to Cain. It is where he works, and it is where he feels most like himself. It's not a coincidence that Abel is there. It is a claim of control and a taking back of space. The next thing that happens is described with heartbreaking restraint. There is no long fight or big speech. Cain gets up against his brother and kills him. In this act, Cain crosses a line that people have never been able to cross again. Jealousy, not war or survival, brings violence into human relationships. The first murder is not about resources. It is about anger. Abel's blood spills onto the same ground where Cain used to work, turning the place where he got his food into a place where he died. Cain's actions don't make his pain go away. It makes it bigger. Abel's silence is now permanent, and Cain is left to make his own decision. When God asks Cain where Abel is, Cain's answer, "Am I my brother's keeper?" shows that he doesn't fully understand what it means to be responsible. The question is both defensive and philosophical. It goes against the idea that people are responsible for each other. This moment would have a big impact on history. Cain's unwillingness to take responsibility becomes as important as the murder itself. The story says that harm can't be hidden, that blood cries out, and that actions leave marks that go beyond what was meant. Cain is no longer just a brother or a farmer. He is now a symbol of what happens when people don't control their inner conflicts. But even here, the story doesn't take away Cain's humanity. He is afraid of dying. He is afraid of getting back at him. He is afraid that he will turn into what he has made his brother. The mark on him is not just a punishment. It is also a way to keep him safe. Cain has to live, move around, and remember. The story makes Cain and Abel more like real people, which keeps listeners from being distant. It doesn't ask who is right. It asks what happens when feelings control actions. People in the Middle Ages would later see themselves in Cain's fight, Abel's weakness, and the thin line between anger and destruction. And it is from this profoundly human inception that broader moral and symbolic interpretations would commence to develop. The death of Abel does not end the story's tension. Rather, it marks the moment when it intensifies, expanding from a singular act into a persistent moral rift. The story of Cain is powerful not just because of what he did, but also because of what was going on inside him long before he raised his hand. The real conflict happens in Cain's mind and spirit, where feelings, thoughts, and decisions all come together. Cain doesn't get angry right away after the offering is turned down. It settles down. It gets harder. Ancient people knew what this kind of anger was like. The slow, corrosive anger that builds up when someone feels ignored or wronged. The story doesn't show Cain going crazy all of a sudden. Instead, it shows him fighting with himself. The text says that his face falls, which shows that his inner balance is clearly breaking down. This was a warning sign in a world where feelings and morals were the same thing. God's answer to Cain is very personal. Instead of being punished, Cain is asked a question. People ask him why he is angry and why his face has fallen. This moment changes the way we see the conflict, making it about self-awareness. There is no accusation against Cain. He is invited to think. The warning that follows is one of the most psychologically deep things in ancient scripture. It says that sin is something outside of us but very close to us, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. It is said to Cain that he must rule over it. Centuries later, this image had a strong effect on medieval thought. People didn't just see sin as an action. They saw it as a force that stalks the human soul and feeds on unchecked emotion. The story of Cain became a model for how to understand temptation not as a quick fall, but as a slow giving in. Medieval sermons often came back to this moment to stress that Cain was warned and that he didn't fail because he didn't know better, but because he didn't want to. As Cain's inner turmoil increases, Abel remains oblivious or unaffected by it. This imbalance makes the tragedy worse. Abel goes on with his life, quiet and unguarded, but Cain's view of him changes. Abel is no longer Abel. He is now a symbol of rejection. This change in the mind is very important. Cain does not hate Abel for who he is, but for what he represents. Please, acceptance, God's blessing. Cain thinks that Abel's life is an accusation. Medieval writers were very interested in this change. They said that violence doesn't start with the hand, but with the heart. Cain's failure was not just moral, it was also social. He let other people decide how much he was worth. He didn't look at what he had to offer. Instead, he compared himself to his brother. This comparison inside led to destruction outside. The field where Cain leads Abel is a silent part of the fight. It is an open space, but it is also very private, a place to work, sweat, and be alone. In medieval symbolism, fields were often seen as the world itself, the place where people's choices are shown. By choosing this place, Cain makes his inner conflict public. What was once hidden is now permanent. The act itself is described in a way that is very simple but very powerful. The emotional build-up that led to it is where the real weight is. Cain's rage, which was directed inward, finally finds an outlet. This release is not a relief. Medieval philosophers asserted that sin offers resolution yet results in enslavement. The moment Cain acts does not free him from pain, it keeps him in it. There is no more talking after Abel dies. There is no reason to celebrate, no reason to be happy, and no reason to win. Cain is the only one who made the choice. The fight has reached its peak, but the effects are just starting to show. God's question to Cain about where his brother is sounds like the one before it. Once more, Cain is asked to speak up and face the truth. This time, his answer is sharper and more defensive. He says he is not responsible. This denial became a big part of moral teaching in the Middle Ages. People thought that what Cain said was the worst way to avoid his duty to the community. People didn't think, "Am I my brother's keeper?" was a real question. They thought it was a way of saying they didn't want to be responsible for their actions. This refusal hit hard in feudal societies where loyalty, hierarchy, and duty were important. Cain was no longer just a killer. He was a sign that society was falling apart. But even as judgment draws near, the narrative defies simplicity. Cain's fear comes out. He knows how serious what he did is. He expects to be punished, cut off from others, and die. This fear makes him seem more human again. Medieval readers didn't think of Cain as purely evil. They thought of him as tragically torn between two sides. He couldn't control his inner conflict, so he has to live with the consequences. The escalating conflict in Cain's narrative imparts a perennial lesson. The most perilous confrontations are frequently unseen. Jealousy doesn't usually show itself as hate. Anger often hides behind hurt pride. And when these feelings aren't dealt with, they don't go away. They just wait. The story of Cain makes it clear that moral failure doesn't happen all at once. It grows in the human heart, one step at a time. This made Cain very relatable to people in the Middle Ages. He was not a monster from a story, but a man who stood at the crossroads of choice and turned away. And it was this gradual, human escalation from disappointment to anger, from anger to violence that made sure Cain's story would live on, whispered in sermons, carved into stone, and painted into glass as a warning for all generations to come. The violent moment between Cain and Abel is like a dark wound in human history that sits at the center of the story. It is the point at which inner conflict turns into action that can't be changed, and thought turns into action. Readers and theologians in the Middle Ages saw this moment not only as the first murder, but also as the first visible break in human brotherhood, a line crossed from which humanity could never fully return. The biblical text describes the act in a very calm way. In the field, Cain attacks Abel and kills him. There is no description of the weapon, no record of Abel's last words, and no attempt to make the fight more exciting. This silence is planned. It makes the listener face the seriousness of the act without being distracted. Medieval commentators frequently observed that the absence of detail rendered the event more potent rather than diminished. People aren't interested in how Abel died. They're more interested in the fact that Cain chose to kill. For thinkers in the Middle Ages, this simplicity brought to light a scary truth. Great evil doesn't need a lot of planning or reasons. It only takes a moment when you let go of your self-control. Cain's actions are sudden, but they are not random. It is the release of all the things that have been building up inside him: anger, envy, humiliation, and hurt pride into one decision that can't be changed. The field where the murder happens has a deeper meaning. It is not a battlefield or a city street. It is a place where people work. Medieval interpretations stress this setting to show that violence doesn't always come from chaos. It often happens in places we know. The ground that used to grow seeds now grows blood. The same soil that Cain worked becomes the silent witness to his crime, turning food into an accusation. In medieval theology, blood was never just a physical thing. It had moral and spiritual meaning. People say that Abel's blood cries out from the ground, which is a powerful image that really hit home in a world where people believed in divine justice. This cry is not for revenge, it is for recognition. It says that violence can't be hidden, and that even when there are no witnesses left, creation itself speaks out. People saw Abel's murder as more than just the death of one person. It signified the demise of innocence in interpersonal relationships. Medieval texts often say that Abel was righteous not because he was perfect, but because he had faith. He didn't protect himself from his brother. His weakness was a part of the tragedy. In this way, Abel's death showed a new truth. Trust could be broken, even in a family. After the act, not much is said about how Cain felt, but medieval scholars thought about it a lot. They thought about how shocking it would be to realize that violence wouldn't make their pain go away, and how heavy it would feel to be suddenly alone. Cain's action didn't make him better, it made him alone. The brother he didn't like is gone, but the emptiness is still there. When God asks Cain, "Where is your brother?" after the murder, the question has a different meaning than it did before. Theologians from the Middle Ages said that this wasn't a request for information, but an invitation to confess. Before he is judged, Cain is given one last chance to take responsibility and tell the truth. His defensive and dismissive response shows how far he has fallen. The question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" becomes a second sin on top of the first. This refusal to take responsibility changed Cain's crime from a crime of passion to a moral stance. Medieval moralists viewed this as the instant Cain completely accepted separation not merely from Abel, but from communal responsibility itself. This refusal went against the very foundation of social order in societies where people had to help each other to stay alive. The murder's importance went beyond religion to include law and morality. Medieval legal traditions frequently referenced Cain as the epitome of criminal culpability. People used his story to show that intent matters, that denial makes guilt worse, and that silence won't get you out of trouble. Cain became the model for what happens when you don't take responsibility. But even here, the story doesn't take away Cain's humanity. He does not die. He has not been erased. Instead, he has to deal with what he did. Medieval interpretations stressed that the punishment that follows is not immediate death, but life filled with memory, fear, and wandering. This made Cain's fate even worse than death. He has to live with what he did. The climax of the first murder isn't just the killing, it's also the realization that violence changes the world forever. The ground has changed. People's relationships with each other have changed. The idea of moral consequence is no longer just an idea. It is real, permanent, and unchangeable. People in the Middle Ages really understood this because they lived in a world where violence was common but never unimportant. For them, Cain's deed was a warning written into the history books. It said that the biggest tragedies usually start quietly, grow inside, and end in a single moment that can't be changed. And it is from this moment, this first shedding of innocent blood, that the full force of divine judgment, exile, and legacy would soon be felt. The fight that happens after Abel's death changes the story from human violence to divine judgment, showing how much the murder has changed Cain's relationship with the world around him. God's tone when he talks to Cain again is no longer warning but judicial. There is no longer a chance to rule over sin. What is left is responsibility. The question, "Where is your brother Abel?" resonates throughout the narrative with intentional seriousness. Medieval theologians frequently asserted that this question reflects earlier passages in Scripture, wherein divine inquiry encourages confession rather than revealing ignorance. God isn't looking for information. He's giving Cain one last chance to tell the truth. Cain's answer, on the other hand, is evasive and hard. In one breath, he says he doesn't know anything and doesn't take responsibility. By doing this, he cuts himself off not only from his brother but also from the moral order itself. This refusal makes the judgment that comes next stronger. People in the Middle Ages often used the phrase, "Abel's blood cries out from the ground." Once blood is shed, it cannot be silenced. It turns into evidence. The earth itself becomes a witness, bringing moral action and physical reality closer together. People in the Middle Ages who thought that creation reflected divine order were scared by this picture. Sin didn't go away after the act. It became part of the world. The punishment given to Cain is complicated and full of meaning. He is not put to death. Instead, he is cursed from the place where he used to work. The soil that soaked up Abel's blood won't give Cain any more strength. He is no longer a farmer. Medieval interpretations regarded this as a significant manifestation of justice. The means of Cain's pride transforms into the origin of his anguish. What he used to be able to control now fights back against him. Cain is doomed to be a wanderer, a fugitive on the earth. This exile is more important than being physically separated. Medieval thinkers believed that wandering meant living without a home, protection, or purpose. Loyalty, land, and lordship were important parts of society in the Middle Ages. Because Cain was always wandering, he was always outside of the social and spiritual order. Once again, Cain's reaction to the judgment shows that he is human. He doesn't complain about the punishment being fair. Instead, he is afraid of what will happen as a result. He thinks that the weight of his guilt will make him an easy target for violence from others. This fear reveals a bitter irony. Cain, who brought murder into human relationships, is now afraid of becoming a victim of it. Medieval scholars thought of this as violence turning inward. What one puts into the world comes back to them. God puts a mark on Cain because he is afraid. The nature of this mark is never made clear, which led to centuries of different interpretations. Writers in the Middle Ages argued about whether it was real, spiritual, or just a symbol. Some thought it was a clear sign of shame. Some people said it was a sign of mercy that protected. What mattered most was what it did. Cain was not to be killed. This moment made people in the Middle Ages feel uneasy. Mercy for a murderer called into question simple ideas of justice. Cain was punished, but he was also saved. He was punished, but also protected. This duality became very important in medieval theology. The mark of Cain was a contradiction. Punishment without death and judgment without death. He had to live with his sin and carry it forward as a lesson for others. In medieval times, being exiled was often seen as worse than dying. A man without a home was a man without a name. Cain's punishment made sure that he would always remember Abel. Every step made him realize how much it would cost him. His life served as a poignant reminder that violence harms not only victims but also perpetrators. When Cain left God's presence, it was a big change in his spiritual life. He goes east, which in medieval literature is often seen as a sign that he is far from God's favor. He moves to the land of Nod, which sounds like a place where people wander and can't settle down. Even after settling down, Cain is still not at peace. Stability is an illusion. Medieval interpreters viewed Cain's exile as a cautionary tale rather than a resolution. His life goes on, but it is affected by what he does. He builds and survives, but he does so with the weight of what he has done. This idea that life goes on after sin, but never unchanged, really hit home in a world where confession, penance, and memory shaped religious life. Cain's judgment reveals a key truth in the story. Divine justice is not just about punishment. It is also about bringing things to light. History doesn't forget about Cain. He becomes a part of it. His wandering presence makes people remember how much it costs to let their feelings run wild and not take responsibility. For people in the Middle Ages, Cain's exile was more than just the story of one man's fate. It explained why the world feels like it's always on the move and why people are afraid, violent, and displaced. Cain was no longer just the first person to kill someone. He was the first exile, and his guilt has been passed down through the generations. He walks through history as a reminder that choices cannot be changed. As the years went by and the story of Cain spread through medieval Europe, it started to look different. Words weren't enough anymore. Artists, scribes, and craftsmen turned the story into pictures that people could see, think about, and remember. In a time when most people couldn't read, art became religion, and Cain's story was painted, carved, and lit up as a warning in light and shadow. Illuminated manuscripts were one of the best ways to keep and understand Cain's story. Monks working in candlelit scriptoria decorated biblical texts with detailed pictures, using color and symbols to convey moral meaning. People didn't often see Cain as a monster. He looked human instead. His face was often tense, his posture was heavy, and his eyes were downcast. This was on purpose. Artists from the Middle Ages wanted people to see themselves in him. It wasn't dangerous to be different. It was dangerous to be the same. In many manuscript images, the moment of offering is more important than the murder itself. The two men, Cain and Abel, are shown next to each other with their sacrifices going up to heaven. Abel's offering rises cleanly, and it is often shown with divine light or an angelic presence. Cain's offering, on the other hand, sinks or is ignored. The difference in how things looked reinforced a theological lesson. What you mean matters. People in the Middle Ages could understand the message right away, even if they didn't read the text. The murder scene was often quiet but still creepy when it was shown. The fact that Cain hits Abel in open space like fields, hills, or bare ground shows that violence can happen anywhere. Abel is often shown with a look of surprise on his face instead of fear, which shows innocence and betrayal. When blood is shown, it's very little but on purpose. A single red line on pale earth was enough to show that something was lost forever. Stained glass windows in churches from the Middle Ages made the story even better. These pictures, which were lit by the sun, made Cain's story come to life. Scenes from the brothers' lives came and went throughout the day as light passed through colored glass. This showed how morality changes over time. The lesson was clear to the parishioners without the need for sermons. The windows spoke silently but powerfully. Tapestries and stone carvings also brought Cain's image into both public and religious places. Cain often showed up on the walls of cathedrals next to other people who had done wrong, making a visual family tree of sin. These images connected Cain to larger patterns in human behavior, implying that his crime was not an isolated incident but rather a fundamental one. He was the start of a long history of moral decline. Medieval literature made Cain more well-known than just in the Bible. His story came to life on public stages in mystery plays and morality plays. Actors made Cain look conflicted, angry, and hurt, and they often made his emotional turmoil seem worse than it really was to make the lesson clear. These shows weren't very subtle. They were meant to directly challenge audiences and make them see how easily feelings can turn into destruction. During this time, poems and sermons often used Cain as a warning. People used his name as a short way to say jealousy and betrayal. Writers used him to warn against being proud, comparing yourself to others, and being angry. In a society that values order and obedience, Cain represented the disorder that happens when personal grievances take precedence over community responsibility. One of the most interesting things about medieval art is how rarely Cain is shown by himself. Even in exile scenes, the world around him is closing in on him: twisted trees, dark skies, and empty land. Nature shows how he feels inside. This reflected the medieval idea that moral chaos upset the balance of the universe. Cain's sin did not stay inside. It changed the world around him. On the other hand, Abel is often in the light, with animals, or under open skies. He is linked to peace and divine favor, which strengthens the story's moral divide. But even Abel's picture is limited. Medieval artists didn't want to make his death seem like a great thing. They focused on loss instead. Abel's absence is just as important as his presence. Cain's story became a part of everyday life in the Middle Ages through art and literature. People saw it in churches, heard it in town squares, and remembered it in their culture. These depictions made sure that Cain was not forgotten or made into an idea. He stayed alive as a warning that everyone could see, no matter their education or social status. This visual and narrative legacy was very important for medieval society. It turned old scriptures into real-life experiences. Cain was no longer a distant figure from the Bible. He was a mirror of what anyone could become if they let their feelings run wild. And his story kept speaking through brush, stone, and glass, softly but constantly, reminding everyone who saw it that the line between good and bad is thinner than it seems. The story of Cain was a big topic of deep intellectual and religious debate in the Middle Ages. In addition to art and popular stories, monasteries, universities, and cathedral schools turned what Cain did into questions about sin, free will, justice, and what it means to be responsible as a person. Medieval scholars did not read the story just to tell it again. They broke it down, argued about it, and used it to explain how people relate to God and to each other. One of the most talked about questions was why Abel's offering was accepted and Cain's was not. Medieval theologians were careful not to make the answer only about material value. They instead focused on what they meant to do. They said that Cain gave to God because he had to, but Abel gave because he wanted to. This difference became very important in medieval moral theology. People judged actions not only by what was done, but also by how they felt about them. The main topic of these talks was free will. People often used the story of Cain to show that people can choose between good and bad. The warning that Cain got before the murder was very important evidence. Scholars contended that sin does not forcibly dominate the human will. Rather, it awaits consent. Cain's failure was not predetermined. It was capitulation. This interpretation influenced medieval perspectives on moral responsibility and confession. Philosophers like Augustine and later Thomas Aquinas regarded Cain as an exemplar of disordered love. Cain loved himself more than he loved doing the right thing, his brother, or the truth that came from God. People thought that this turning of love inward was the cause of sin. Abel, on the other hand, showed love that was in the right order by putting God before his own interests. This difference had an effect on medieval ideas about pride and humility. The issue of divine justice was also very important. Why didn't they kill Cain? Why did he get protection after killing someone? Scholars in the Middle Ages had a hard time with this tension. Many people thought that God's judgment wasn't just punishment, but also teaching. Cain was kept alive as a lesson. His survival made sure that the effects of sin would last over time instead of being erased in an instant. People started to talk a lot about the mark of Cain. Some theologians thought it was a visible sign meant to warn other people. Some said it was spiritual, something that people carried inside them. The common thread among these interpretations was the idea that the mark permanently set Cain apart from innocence. He could survive, yet he could not forget. This idea was very similar to medieval ideas of penance, which said that remembering and feeling sorry were important for spiritual growth. Another big argument was about Cain's question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Medieval scholars perceived this not as ignorance, but as insurrection. It was seen as the first philosophical rejection of social responsibility. This question hit the heart of social ethics in a medieval world based on hierarchy and mutual obligation. Cain's refusal served as the negative basis for the development of concepts such as duty, charity, and community. Some medieval philosophers went even further and saw Cain as the model of cruel rulers and tyrants. His jealousy of God's favor was like the jealousy of kings who didn't like having their power limited. According to this view, Abel stood for the person who suffers for doing the right thing. This interpretation enabled the narrative to be relevant to both individuals and political and social frameworks. There were also arguments about what repentance really means. Could Cain have been saved? Some people thought that his punishment gave him a chance to repent, while others thought that his refusal to confess closed that door. This tension was a sign of bigger fights in the Middle Ages over mercy and justice, forgiveness and responsibility. These ideas were put to the test in Cain. The unique value of Cain's story to medieval theology was its openness. The text did not answer all of the questions. It asked for interpretation, made people think, and didn't let things get too simple. This made it possible for generations of scholars to go back to it and find new meanings that were important to their time. By the end of the Middle Ages, Cain was no longer just a character in the Bible. He was a way to understand why people fail. His story influenced sermons, confessions, legal reasoning, and moral instruction. Through debate and commentary, Cain became a mirror that showed people what was going on inside them. It reminded people that the biggest threats come from within, not from outside. As medieval thought evolved, the narrative of Cain transcended theology and art, permeating the very fabric of society. His legacy subtly influenced communal perceptions of crime, punishment, exile, and moral identity. People in the Middle Ages no longer just saw Cain as a character from the Bible or a sermon. He became a symbol for how they thought about violence in their own lives. Medieval law was one of the strongest social echoes of Cain's story. Murder was not seen as just a private crime. It was seen as a break in the community's moral order. People saw Cain's act against Abel as the first crime that needed to be punished in public. Legal scholars used this story to say that killing people not only hurt the killer, but also the land. So, justice wasn't just about getting back at someone. It was also about bringing things back into balance. Exile as a punishment had a special meaning. They didn't put Cain in jail or kill him. They sent him away. Exile was a harsh punishment in medieval times, especially for crimes that threatened the peace of the community. People thought that being cut off from their land, family, and safety was worse than death. In this way, Cain's wandering was the first example of social death. The notion of being marked also affected how medieval societies dealt with wrongdoers. People often used symbols, clothes, or physical signs to identify criminals in public. Even though these practices were different in different areas, the main idea was always the same. Wrongdoing left a mark. The offender, like Cain, could live among others, but they could never forget what they had done. In medieval moral discourse, especially when talking about charity and social responsibility, people kept asking Cain's question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" People in a society where they had to take care of each other to stay alive saw this question as a warning. To say you weren't responsible for someone else's pain was to do what Cain did. Giving to the poor, being hospitable, and protecting the weak were all seen as direct rejections of Cain's way of thinking. Cain's story was used to teach people in guilds, monasteries, and local communities. Apprentices and beginners were taught that jealousy could ruin not only relationships but also whole businesses. In economies that were closely linked, jealousy was bad. The way Cain felt about Abel was similar to the rivalries that could tear apart medieval social structures. The story also changed how people thought about how siblings should get along and how to divide up an inheritance. In medieval Europe, brothers often fought over land and favor. Cain's act was the most serious warning of what could happen if competition got out of hand. Legal frameworks often stressed fair division and mediation, which was an unconscious way of trying to keep history from repeating itself. The way people thought about strangers and outsiders in the Middle Ages was affected by Cain's wandering. People were supposed to be hospitable, but they were also suspicious of people who didn't have roots. The figure of the wanderer was both scary and interesting. Cain was a man who was protected by God but was also cut off from his community. This duality influenced the perceptions of migrants, exiles, and travelers in medieval societies. In certain areas, Cain became linked to the beginnings of violence itself. Chroniclers who wrote about wars and feuds said that cycles of violence went back to the first murder. People thought that Cain's act was the first time violence happened in human history and that it never really went away. In a way, every fight was a repeat of that first blow. Even though Cain's story had a lot of bad things in it, it also had a strange kind of restraint. If God spared Cain, then perhaps mercy exists, even after significant transgression. In some cases, this idea made medieval justice less harsh, giving people a chance to repent and rejoin society. Cain was punished, but not killed. The story of Cain became a part of everyday life in the Middle Ages by influencing laws, social norms, and moral standards. It shaped how people thought about crime, community, and their own duties. Long after the biblical text was written, Cain walked through medieval streets, not as a person, but as an idea that shaped how societies tried to stop the next brother from killing another. As medieval thinkers kept thinking about Cain's legacy, the story began to have more psychological and symbolic meaning. People no longer saw Cain as just a historical figure or a moral example. They saw him as a symbol of inner human conflict. Medieval writers increasingly portrayed his struggle as an internal conflict inherent in all individuals, a contest among desire, resentment, faith, and restraint. Cain was most often linked to jealousy. Medieval theologians characterized envy as a covert sin, one that proliferates unnoticed until it engulfs the soul. At first, Cain's jealousy of Abel wasn't because he hated him, it was because he compared them. He compared his worth to his brother's and found that he wasn't as good. This internal judgment was the start of the end. Medieval sermons said that envy grows where humility is not present. Anger came after jealousy, and medieval philosophers were careful to show how one feeling leads to another. Cain's rage did not manifest as immediate violence. Rather, it was enduring, internalized, and unresolved. This slow build made what he did even scarier. It suggested that the most dangerous thing is not sudden anger, but feelings that build up over time. Guilt had a complicated role in how people in the Middle Ages thought about Cain. After killing Abel, Cain didn't deny what he did. Instead, he tried to avoid taking responsibility. Scholars in the Middle Ages thought this was the mind's way of trying to get away from moral weight. They said that guilt makes you confess. When someone refuses to confess, guilt turns into loneliness. Cain's wandering was a sign of his inner exile. The land's rejection of Cain also had psychological significance. Medieval authors viewed the cursed ground as a representation of the forfeiture of inner tranquility. Cain could work, but he wouldn't be happy with it. Effort without fruit became a metaphor for a life that was not in line with moral order. This idea really hit home in a medieval world where work was a big part of who you were and what you did. Fear became another important part of Cain's condition. His fear of being killed after killing someone showed that he knew what was right and wrong. Medieval philosophers perceived this fear not as cowardice, but as acknowledgement. Cain knew that violence makes a world where violence is normal. His fear was like the world he had helped make. People often thought of the mark on Cain as a psychological rather than a physical one. Medieval mystics called it an inner sign, a constant awareness of doing something wrong that couldn't be erased. This mark on the inside of Cain's body kept him from forgetting what he had done. Memory itself became part of his punishment, which is in line with medieval ideas that true suffering is often mental rather than physical. Cain's inability to get back what he lost became a big part of who he was mentally. There was no way to bring Abel back, and no amount of work or giving could change what had already happened. Medieval authors used this to show that some effects last forever. It may be possible to forgive, but once innocence is lost, it cannot be regained. The story also looked at the conflict between being alone and being safe. Cain was cut off from society, but God protected him. People in the Middle Ages thought this was proof that punishment and mercy can work together. Cain's life was saved, but he was still alone. This duality showed how people in the Middle Ages thought of justice as both fair and kind. By making Cain a psychological figure, medieval thought turned his story into a mirror for the mind. His fight was no longer far away or long ago, it was happening right now, and to him, Cain was a warning not just about murder, but also about the feelings that come before it. His story taught that the most dangerous battles happen long before anything is seen, and that the way to destruction often starts in the hidden parts of the heart. By the later medieval period, the narrative of Cain started to extend beyond theology, psychology, and social order into mythological and symbolic realms. Writers, historians, and folklorists included Cain in larger stories that explained where human suffering, violence, and even some groups of people and places came from. In the Middle Ages, people imagined Cain as a mysterious figure who went beyond the Bible. One of the most well-known medieval stories linked Cain to the rise of forbidden knowledge. Some texts said that Cain, who had lost God's favor, turned to hidden wisdom, which are arts and skills that God does not approve of. Blacksmithing, weapon-making, and secret crafts were sometimes seen as connected to Cain's family. These connections showed how people in the Middle Ages were worried about technology and power, especially when knowledge outpaced morality. Cain was also connected to the building of cities. The Bible says that he built a city and named it after his son. Writers from the Middle Ages took this detail and used it to show that the city was both a success and a failure. Cities were places of safety and growth, but they also showed moral decline. Cain's city became a symbol of civilization built on sin order without a spiritual foundation. Some medieval stories went even further and said that Cain was the ancestor of violent or cursed people. These ideas, which were very wrong and later used in the wrong way, were medieval attempts to use biblical genealogy to explain ongoing conflict and suffering. People thought that Cain's bloodline carried restlessness and aggression, which made them believe that sin could pass down through generations. In medieval folklore, the figure of the wandering Jew was sometimes used to represent Cain. Both were perceived as wanderers subjected to divine judgment yet sustained through time. This link was not based on scripture, but on symbols that showed how people in the Middle Ages were interested in eternal punishment and unresolved guilt. Cain's endless wandering served as a model for envisioning perpetual exile. Some medieval bestiaries said that monstrous creatures came from Cain's sin. People said that giants, wild men, and creatures that lived outside of civilization were the children of moral disorder. People believed that Cain's sin broke not only people but also all of creation. These myths made it hard to tell the difference between religion and stories. Some medieval mystical traditions, however, viewed Cain differently, despite these dark expansions. They thought of him as a tragic figure whose pain had a deeper meaning. People thought that Cain's long life of wandering was a way for him to keep paying for his sins. His survival was not a reward, but an opportunity, one that was still open and unresolved. Writers and poets used Cain to talk about fate and choice. Was Cain's fate predetermined by his nature, or did he shape his identity through his actions? This tension drew in people in the Middle Ages. Cain's story didn't give easy answers, which is why it was perfect for moral reflection and allegory. The mythologization of Cain enabled medieval society to externalize fear. There was one place where all the violence, chaos, and pain came from. People saw Cain as a symbol of everything they were afraid of in themselves. Medieval culture tried to make sense of a world that was shaped by war, plague, and instability by projecting these fears outward. The myth and legend of Cain made his shadow bigger than the Bible itself. He became more than just the first murderer. He became the personification of exile, unfulfilled ambition, and unresolved guilt. In the minds of people in the Middle Ages, Cain never really went away. He moved through stories and symbols, reminding each generation that the roots of human darkness are old and still very close by. As the story of Cain spread through medieval Europe, it began to affect not only morals, myths, and society, but also spiritual practice and personal reflection. Monks, mystics, and preachers used the story to help people look inside themselves and face their own desires and moral flaws. The story of Cain was no longer just a story from the past. It was a reflection of the human soul. One of the most important spiritual lessons from Cain was to always be aware of your heart. Medieval sermons focused on the warning God gave Cain: sin is at the door. This picture became a key part of spiritual teaching. It showed that temptation is always there, waiting and ready to take advantage of weakness. People were told to be aware of the signs of anger, envy, and pride before they turned into harmful actions. People often used confession and penance along with meditation on Cain's story. Monks would read the story out loud and think about which parts of their own hearts were open to sin. When they thought about it alone, they could see how Cain's jealousy was similar to their own desires. The story promoted not only moral adherence but profound self-awareness, a vital element of medieval spirituality. Also, Cain's wandering and exile were seen as a sign of spiritual alienation. The sinner's inner state was reflected in their separation from God, their community, and moral order. Medieval mystics saw this exile as a warning. If you don't think, get help, or be humble, you will live a life of disconnection. Cain's journey taught him what happens when you don't take responsibility. The psychological and spiritual aspects of Cain's punishment were profoundly interconnected. Having the mark of Cain meant having memory, awareness, and responsibility. People in the Middle Ages knew that real spiritual growth meant facing their own mistakes and learning from them. In this way, Cain was an early teacher of self-reflection, but sadly, he didn't want to take full advantage of the chance. Preachers often used the story of Cain and Abel to show the difference between good and bad. Abel's goodness, humility, and faith in God were pointed out as good traits to copy. Cain's jealousy, pride, and refusal to take responsibility were used as examples of what not to do. This duality helped people connect moral lessons to their daily lives. People in the congregation could see their own habits in the characters, which made the Bible a personal guide. The story also made the point that brotherhood and shared responsibility are important. "Am I my brother's keeper?" was not just a rhetorical question. It became a moral command. Medieval spiritual instruction underscored that altruism is fundamental to virtuous existence. Not protecting, guiding, or helping your neighbor was the same as doing what Cain did. Communities used this lesson to bring people together and hold them accountable. Cain's life after the murder gave him more spiritual understanding. God's protection of him, despite his guilt and exile, showed how justice and mercy work together. Medieval theologians posited that even individuals who have transgressed could attain divine protection and the chance for contemplation. This gave a more complex view of God's role. Punishment was meant to teach, not just to hurt. Some mystical writings used Cain's inner conflict as a symbol for the struggle between the body and the spirit in the human soul. Envy, anger, and pride were externalized as forces exerting pressure on the self, necessitating deliberate resistance. In this way, Cain's story was almost like an allegory, a way to talk about spiritual warfare in the heart of a person. Medieval thinkers made sure that Cain's story went beyond history and mythology by making him a part of both personal and community spiritual life. It turned into a living tool for thinking about morals, a way to understand temptation, and a guide for moral growth. Through this lens, Cain's story was no longer just about one crime. It was also about the ongoing fight to control desire, stay responsible, and live within the limits of both divine and community order. As medieval interpretations of Cain's story changed, it became clear that the story had lessons that went beyond just personal morality or spiritual reflection. The way that people, cultures, and generations understood human nature, sin, and redemption was shaped by Cain's legacy. By the time the story was fully understood, it had become a complete guide to the human condition, complicated, warning, and deeply moving. Medieval scholars taught that Cain's struggle was universal, and this is one of the lessons that has lasted through time. Although he acted first, his internal struggle with jealousy, pride, anger, and fear was seen as a typical human experience. Everyone has to make choices like these at some point. This framing made the story immediately relevant, turning it from a distant past into a close-up view of the present. People in the Middle Ages were told to think about where envy or pride might be hiding at their own doors. The moral and spiritual aspects of Cain's story fit together perfectly with lessons about community and justice. Relationships, duties, and a hierarchy were the main ways that medieval society was set up. People thought that Cain's refusal to take responsibility was the first crack in the social order of humans. His story showed how important it is to be responsible, care for others, and be on the lookout for unethical behavior. The question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" was a constant reminder that morality is both personal and communal. The story made it clear what would happen if emotions weren't kept in check. Cain's internal conflict unaddressed and unexamined, resulted in irrevocable action. This showed a principle that has always been true. Sin grows from thought to desire to action. Medieval sermons kept saying this, warning people that they need to be morally alert long before their actions show it. The heart of man was a battlefield, and Cain showed what it would cost to lose that battle. Cain's story gave us a deeper understanding of God's justice and mercy, even though he was punished and sent away. He was sentenced to wander and deal with the consequences of his actions, but he was kept safe. Medieval philosophers viewed this duality as a manifestation of divine wisdom. Punishment was seen as corrective and educational, rather than solely punitive. Cain's survival let generations see the long shadow of sin, giving them a living example of the effects of sin, the need to think about it, and the chance to learn, even when redemption was still in doubt. The symbolic extensions of Cain's legacy, his wandering, his mark, his city, and his lineage, enriched his cautionary narrative. Medieval legends and folklore made the story bigger, making it a part of social memory, law, and cultural identity. People were both afraid of and interested in Cain. He was a reminder to society of how fragile moral order is, how dangerous it is to be alone, and how humans can both destroy and think about things. In the end, the story of Cain in medieval thought connects the past and the present. It teaches that moral failure doesn't happen all at once, that relationships with other people are very important, and that the effects of anger, pride, and envy go far beyond the first act. Abel's innocence and Cain's decisions continue to serve as a framework for the examination of ethics, spirituality, and human psychology. The story kept its power, warning, and emotional impact through hundreds of years of interpretation. We really care about you as a viewer. We want to keep learning more about deep knowledge and telling you these stories for a long time. Please help us on our journey by subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and telling your friends about it. Please help us get to 10,000 subscribers and send a super thanks to help us pay for our work so we can keep bringing these deep insights to light. Please also leave a comment below with your name and the city where you are watching this video. The link to the complete Bible with 88 books and the Book of Enoch in English is in the description. The story of Cain is more than just an old story. It is a timeless look at the struggles of people, the consequences of their actions, and the never-ending search for understanding. His shadow reminds us that every choice we make is important, and that being careful, responsible, and thinking about what we do are the keys to living a life that honors both God and other people.